Hi, I am Kathy Merrill. I am the CEO of Washingtonian, and I'm here to discuss this very important topic of resilience, and especially resilience among children and young people. We have some the incredible honor of introducing our panelists and moderator today. Unfortunately, Wesley Lowery was unable to join, but we have some really terrific resources on this important topic. First, I want to introduce Dr. Sandy Chung. She wears a lot of hats. She is maybe best known as the CEO of Trusted Doctors. They have over 22 pediatric locations in Virginia and Maryland. She's also the CEO of Health Connect, which is a health network with over 200 providers. She's the medical director for the Virginia Mental Health Access Program. She teaches at VCU and Georgetown School of Medicine. She is truly an expert in pediatric health, and more specifically, pediatric mental health. She has 4 kids of her own as well, so she is a mom. Dr. Wayne Frederick really needs no introduction. He is the president of Howard University. Besides being a distinguished scholar, I think a lot of people don't realize that he is a real doctor. He is a surgical oncologist. He does surgery and he teaches at the medical college. He has been seeing patients all through this COVID crisis. So we thank him and give him gratitude on behalf of the community for that, on top of his day job. Something a lot of people, I think, don't know about him is that he was kind of an underachiever. He graduated high school at the age of 14 and received his medical degree and his bachelor's degree from Howard at the age of 22. He has had many roles in both the hard sciences and academics. I'm not going to go into all of them, but he comes to us today both as a medical expert, but also a student health expert, because he oversees a body of students at Howard and sees a lot of people in the hospital and overseeing that. I am proud that he was a 2017 Washingtonian of the Year. He is a star in our community. Tamika Tremaglio. She is the managing principal for Deloitte for the Washington area. She oversees, and get this because it's a big number, 14,000 professionals. She is very passionate about the future of work and helping her workforce get through this crisis. She has a JD MBA. She also sees clients. Her clients are some people that you might have heard of: Nestle, the NFL, the NBA Players Association, ExxonMobil, Johnson & Johnson. She sits on many boards. She is going to give us a look into the young workforce and how they are coping and competing. One thing that Deloitte is about and Tamika is about is the business of kindness. And I think when we talk about resilience, kindness and resilience can go together. And so I expect you'll hear some of that from Tamika. Finally, our moderator, Monica Schmude. She is president of Cigna Mid-Atlantic. She is an expert on the healthcare side of things. She was a leader at Aetna before Cigna. She oversees 1,200 Cigna employees with over 1.4 million customers. Washingtonian is a proud customer. Like everyone in this panel, she sits on a lot of boards, the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce. She's on the Dean's Council for the University of Maryland School of Public Health. She received the March of Dimes Hero Award. She is going to be moderating. Thank you for moderating. She's going to discuss with everyone this subject, but Cigna launched a very large project that, Monica, I'm hoping you will weave in some of the facts and figures of this, on resilience, where they surveyed just about 17,000 school-aged children and young adults and parents to see how younger people are holding up during this unprecedented pandemic. And they learned a lot, and there's some things we can do to help. And so, Monica, thank you for Cigna for taking that on, and thank you for moderating. I'm interested to hear about the study and interested to hear from our panelists. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. And I am too, Kathy. Thanks to you, and thanks to all who are joining us in the audience today. This is such an important topic, mental health and resiliency. And on behalf of Cigna, I'm really proud to share the screen with you, Kathy, and this incredible group of panelists. So let's ask ourselves, why are we all here? So we know the pandemic is taking an incredible toll on people, both emotionally and physically. If we take a deeper look across the country and specifically in our region, here's what we've seen. We've seen the excessive impacts of the coronavirus on the African American communities, and which of course, we're already at the heart of issues around racism and negative social determinants of health as well. That's a big one. Here's some other information. In addition, across all of our communities, we're seeing an increase in inpatient hospitalizations for substance use disorders. We're seeing at Cigna an increase of prescriptions for anxiety, for depression, for sleeplessness. Now, these trends are really alarming that I just stated, among other things that we're seeing. But today, and for today's discussion, we really also want to shine the light not only on the issues, but what we can do to address them. Now's the time to take action. Now's the time to get those tips and tricks that Kathy referenced. And really what we found is much of it comes down to the topic that we're focusing on today, and that's the topic of resilience. So let's just think about that for a moment. What is resilience? So we see resilience as the ability to quickly recover from challenges, and we're all facing that probably several times a day, lots of times during the day, during the week, during the month. And so as we look at resilience, we understand that resilience is something that we can recognize pretty easily, but it's really much harder to define it. It's very hard to measure it. And ultimately, what we need to do is create this clear path to how we improve it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to get some great insights to that. As Kathy mentioned, we have developed a Cigna Resilience Index. And as she said, it's the largest study of its kind. And it studied resilience among children and those children's parents. We looked at young adults and we looked at working age adults. And today we're going to cover the whole gamut of that. We released this study in the fall, and along with that, some concrete ways that people can help to cultivate and build their own resilience. We'll talk about that. So through our discussion today, I'm going to reference back to the study and use that as kind of the landing of my questions to the panelists, which I know they're prepared to share their own experiences and most importantly, really their expertise behind this. Such an awesome group of panelists, and I can't wait to get into it. So I'm looking at my screen, and Dr. Chung, I'm going to come to you first. So let me tell you a little bit about the study piece first, looking at the youth, and then I'll come to you to really tap into your expertise. So our study found that 54% of children feel distressed or anxious just due to the pandemic, due to COVID-19. Another data point to point out, 45% of parents of African American children say that an increased awareness of racism actually caused their child anxiety. So as we process those stats, Dr. Chung, you're the pediatrician, right? You've had years of experience working with children. And we know, as a mom, I see that. I already see the vulnerability in children today. But the effects of COVID-19 and other stressors are potentially making those vulnerabilities more obvious. So all the parents who are joining us today really have, I think their first question is, what steps can parents take to determine really how their child is doing, right? Checking in with them, and then what is their overall resiliency levels? Could you help us with that?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me on the panel. As Monica and the others mentioned, I am a pediatrician, but first and foremost, I'm a mother of 4 teenagers, and so have been through the various stages of childhood and looking at resiliency, again, not just in my own children, but in families really across Northern Virginia. I was most recently president of our Virginia state chapter, where we have over 1,000 pediatricians in the state. And we recently did a survey of those pediatricians and found that 88% of the pediatricians in Virginia have seen an increase in anxiety, depression, ADHD, and other mental health disorders in their patients that are coming to them during this pandemic. We know that even before the pandemic that we were seeing an increase in mental health conditions in children. And I would say that for families, as you're looking at your own children or helping your other family members with this, it does vary based on the age of the child. We know that a child's brain development is about 90% completed by the age of 6. So early on, it is extremely important that we look at how we're handling and exposing our children at a very young age to challenges so that they can learn how to become resilient. And so what do I mean by that? Well, there are a few things you can do. One is to make sure that your child has an opportunity to fail. That's really hard, in this day and age. We as parents want to make our children have the safest and the most comfortable environment as possible, so that we know that they will succeed. We want them to feel the joys of success, but it is important that they feel failure as well, especially at a young age, so that when they become young adults, that they know what to do when things don't quite go their way. So give your child the opportunity to fail in that very safe environment. It's also important to say that, to your child, that the goal is not always to be the most successful at the end of whatever the task may be. Sure, we would love for them all to get straight A's, but if they don't, the question is, did they get, find a chunk, a smaller chunk that you can wrap your child's mind around, where you can say, did you make your bed today? Good job, great work. I really like how you made your bed. And then next time you may want to think about making sure your pillow's not on the floor. So really giving them that opportunity to know they did something well, and then but also giving them advice on how to do something better. Without making it punitive. You didn't make your bed right. I've told you 50 times how to make your bed. Why can't you make your bed? That is not going to build resilience. So again, providing those examples too of how to do better. So I find that often parents will say to their child, I want them, they just aren't listening to me. They're so lazy, whatever whatever the criticism might be. But often the kids don't know what it is that you're wanting. So make sure that you're providing concrete examples to them of what they need to do to accomplish whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do. And then lastly, what I would say is provide real examples of what you're doing yourself. So especially for your teenagers, often your teenagers aren't appearing to engage with you, or they don't want to engage with you, whatever the case might be, but they're actually listening. How many times have you said something out loud that you heard as a teenager when you were a teenager, you thought it was really obnoxious, but now you're saying those words yourself to your own kids, right? So we're listening when we're teenagers. We may not look like it, but we certainly are. So keep talking, keep talking out loud, let them hear. The other thing that's helpful is to give an example, even if they didn't bring you a problem, so if you can say something like, when I was in high school, I remember when I didn't get that part in that play that I really wanted, or that's probably not a great COVID example, but you get the idea. I didn't get into something that I wanted to get into, but I'm actually glad I didn't, because that really taught me to keep trying. And when I did, I got this instead, and it really worked out for me. So again, providing them stories of things that you did when you were their age, that can be really helpful. Thanks.
I think that you have a camera into my house, because you're describing some of those scenarios that we have had going on the past few years. Thank you for all those examples. You definitely mentioned a little bit of the how, and it made me think about part of our study focusing on difficult conversations with children. And I can only imagine that parents in our audience today are thinking, yeah, it's hard to have difficult conversations, but what it means to a child's resiliency. You touched on this a little bit. Any other additional tips you might give specific to those more challenging conversations with kids?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important things is to make sure that you're being open and transparent. Our children have access to information like no other generation. So very quickly they will learn if something's happening in the world or something's happening in the community, whether you want them to or not. And so it is important to be open and transparent and to say, hey, if you see on the news or have you heard about this, the answer I usually get back from my teenagers is, of course we have, and so I think the follow-up question is, then, well, what do you think about that? And have a conversation that's age appropriate, but have a conversation with them so that you can get a sense of what they're thinking about and internalizing. What you really don't want them to do is get their information on how to react from someone else other than your family, because your family, you have your own belief systems, your own values, and you want to instill those in your children. So they are getting the information, and really it's best that you give them the perspective that you want them to have as your child. So again, being open and transparent and having those conversations, don't be afraid of them. Again, they're having them without you otherwise.
That's a good point. That makes me think about the impact, which we'll get to, about social media with our youth. So I'll come back to that. I'm going to kind of pin that up and come back to it. Dr. Chung, staying with you, and just another question. You're also a prominent employer, and I can't help but think, and as I was thinking and preparing for today's discussion, about your employees, the physicians, and what they're dealing with during this time. Not specific to resiliency study that I can reference, but I'm really curious, and I think our attendees here today would want to know, how are the physicians, how are they doing?
Yeah, so in pediatrics, we're obviously frontline providers, and in our IPA, we have internal medicine, family practice, and pediatrics. And I would say your healthcare providers are tired. So I think continuing to provide them support, recognizing that there's, even if with the vaccine and the presence of a vaccine and testing, the disease itself is a virus. It's not going to magically disappear or go anywhere. So we will have this disease for quite some time. And so the good news is, though, with the vaccine and treatments, though, hopefully it won't be as devastating as it has been. So I think continuing to provide that support, the resiliency piece for your healthcare providers and all of your essential workers, not just healthcare, is key to getting us through this pandemic. And so and I know the others will touch on the adult response and to resiliency and some of the things we can do to help our workers. But yes, I think just recognizing everyone's working really hard.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if they're not joining us today for our discussion, just extending our thanks for all that they do and all that you do
Thank you.
in supporting us.
Appreciate it.
Dr. Frederick, you ready? I'm going to come to you next. Dr. Chung, you can stop, take a drink, take a break. We're going to pivot now to young adults. And the next question series will be for you. Our study showed for the young adults that they have the highest risk of low levels of resilience. I think of that as a curve, right? And they're the bottom of the curve. In fact, 4 of 5 of our study in the young adult group are displaying a low propensity of resilience versus an adult. So these are ones that, this is a group that we should really be concerned about. And your undergraduate students fall right in that. They're right in that curve. So as a university president, Dr. Frederick, how have you and your staff really taken steps to fortify the mental health of the students that you serve? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so thanks again for having me. This is a complicated issue. What we've tried to do is to provide services in terms of expanding our counseling services, and the government, to their credit, really helped universities like Howard at the beginning of the pandemic, recognizing when we got everyone home that they would have lost the ability to interact with counselors that they may have formed relationships with. And so obviously you can't practice across state lines, et cetera. So they loosened that requirement. However, unfortunately, it turns out that requirement was only temporary. We continued to not only expand those services, but we looked for more local engagement as well. And so we did work with the authorities and local municipalities, work with other care providers, to ensure that students could continue to have that interaction and transferring information, et cetera. But then we recognized that we had to pivot to a more proactive, that was reacting to people with needs, but then we had to ensure that there was more proactive engagement. And so we set up a series of engagements, everything from happy hours to, kind of come and listen sessions, trying to get students in various groups so that they could really get the type of bonding that they get in college. And I think one of the reasons for that low level of resilience you saw in your study is it ties back to how young adults really get their confidence and how they develop their resilience. One part of it is failure, but the other part is recovery and ultimate triumph in spite of failure. I tend to tell my kids and the young people here at Howard that anything that comes too easy probably isn't worth it. But when you've really toiled for it, it makes that victory that much sweeter. But what it also does is it really kind of, straightens your back and gets you ready for that next fight. And it's hard to do that in a virtual setting because you don't have that classmate next to you that you can say, I just didn't understand that, or I didn't get that question right, or, at home in this very unusual, isolated environment, taking your punches and your losses kind of on your own. And so we have to create community virtually so that that type of supporting, and also you don't have to suffer trauma yourself. Observing your friend stumble or fail is also important because you're providing that support is part of what allows young people to gain that type of leadership quality or to gain that type of support mechanism as well. And so we have to make sure that we're creating those opportunities so that we can help with on all those fronts.
I want to just keep listening to you. There are so many parallels in what you just explained. I'm a mom of a high schooler and also a first year college student. So what you're saying completely is resonating with me. And what I know is, and what our audience knows is college, as we know it, has significantly changed because of the pandemic and probably for the foreseeable future. I'm going to continue on this line of questioning. I've kind of two-part question for you. So first, parents like me, right, or students who are listening or hearing from you, how should we be preparing for college for the next few years from what you see today? And along with that, the next part of the questions are really around, are there skills or conversations that we should be having now with each other, right, as parents in preparation, or with our students, because they're shifting from that, childhood experience Dr. Chung described to us into this young adult group that we're concerned about. So any conversations, skills, and then just how should we be thinking about college overall?
Yeah, for the sake of full disclosure, I'm the father of a 16-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter. My 14-year-old daughter is an activist, attorney, and everything else. So she's going on 34. It feels like a couple of things I would say to answer, kind of put both parts together, because I do think that they intersect, and they do so, I think, kind of nicely. College has changed. There's no doubt about it. But we have at Howard, one of the philosophies that I've tried to impart on my institution is that I am obsessed with the journey of life, because there's no destination I'll come upon that will completely fulfill me, and that the joy is what should happen under every day, doing the things that should never become mundane. I think sometimes on the journey we look beyond the journey, and so I tell the freshman students all the time, you get in here as a freshman, and then the very next day you start planning for, man, I can't wait till I graduate so I won't have to do this or that, or if I become wealthy, this is what I'm going to do. And all of a sudden the 4 years in between become a task as opposed to a joy. And that joy can be experienced on a campus interacting with others. It can be experienced in doing a math problem and working with others virtually, etc. So the first thing that I would suggest that parents and students should be thinking about when they think of college is reminding students that it's part of a journey. And while that journey may look different, the landscape is looking different, it still is a part of a journey, and they still have to find ways to find joy in the everyday doing. On the second aspect of it, in terms of skills, we have to create more circumstances to create the social interaction, even if the social interaction is not with their peers. Now, in my circumstance, my 16-year-old son plays soccer fairly competitively, and my 14-year-old daughter plays volleyball fairly competitively. And what I have noticed is a significant change in their mood from the early stage of the pandemic to when their sports started back. That being able to go out and play with other, even with the mask on and even with the social distancing, they needed that social interaction. They needed that exchange of the human contact. To be quite honest, the essence of the human condition is interaction. It's not isolation. But we can do that at home as well. And that's what we've been encouraging. So we have a parents group at Howard. I meet with them once a month, a parents committee. And I encourage them to do things with their college students who happen to be at home. In my house, that's cooking. I'm not the greatest of cooks, but on a weekend, part of my task is to cook with my 16 and 14-year-old. And I'm telling you, we've had 4-hour dinners after that. Not that the meal was that great, but it creates an opportunity for conversation. Teaching them to peel potatoes, things that I thought were mundane that they would get, or cucumbers. I mean, that discourse creates a social interaction that they are thirsting for. And the last thing I'd say, which I think is proof of the pudding, when I became president and we did orientation, I tell the students, write a letter to your parents that first day, and I want you to open it at graduation and give it to them. Just write it. I don't want you to type it. I want you to make errors in your spelling and cross it out and send it to them. Don't use autocorrect, no text, etc. And several students have done that, and their parents have always come back and said that was the most amazing thing to have them do. And I say that to say that even in this high-tech world, our students, our young people are thirsting for interactions with us. They're happy to go off to college to quote unquote get away from their parents, but they actually want you right there with them. And you have that opportunity now. So give them their space during class time, but create opportunities, even if it's a long walk, cooking a meal where you can still get that one-on-one interaction.
I listen, I know we're virtual, but I sense our audience really grounded in a lot of things that you're saying, especially around that physical activity when referencing, the sports and how to make sure that you saw such a change in your own children, and then how you talk to the students and their parents about the importance of that. And I bet at the end of this, you'll be a great cook no matter what. You'll try great recipes and, new things. Not only that, plus the great memories you're building. I'm going to pivot here a little bit, Dr. Frederick. I'm going to stay with you, but I'm going to step a little bit away from resilience overall from a student and parent perspective and talk about something that really I know a lot of our listeners will want to hear about, and that's a conversation around racial disparity. It's been on the top. It's on the mind of everybody, especially on college campuses, and I'm sure Howard's no exception. So our study actually found that young adults are feeling more stressed and anxious about the deaths of Black Americans than they're feeling about the current economic uncertainty, right? It's very much weighing on them. And so again, big pivot here, thinking back to what you're doing and the staff, how are you approaching these difficult conversations is part of it, but also really importantly, how are you ensuring that the students are walking away right in a virtual environment, feeling that their concerns are actually being heard?
Yeah, this is a difficult one, but again, one that we feel at Howard we're well poised to deal with because our DNA is social justice, and Howard has been for its 153 years on a journey towards social justice. What's different right now is that many more people have joined that caravan, and we're happy for those people to join that caravan. But just like in the civil rights era, people will leave the caravan. And so what we've tried to focus our students on is that you still have a responsibility to stay focused on the journey to that ultimate destination. We may not arrive there now, but we will make significant progress. And while we do have others joining the caravan, it's our responsibility to educate, to embrace, to listen and learn as well. But to make sure that we make changes that are sustainable. and that will stand, the nexus of time that we're in. The students at the same time, I think some of the anxiety that exists has major repercussions because these are things that people usually suffer silently. And now the embodiment of their pain and suffering is seen in a George Floyd. And that's why I think some of this creates such raw emotions. So what we must do, I think, as an entire community, and certainly as a university, we're doing this, is to make sure we give voice to that. But we also do it in a constructive manner. I tell students we can't romanticize protesting. We have to be looking at what are the tangible solutions that we want to see in our society and how can we work with everyone in order to realize those. And so that's where we have been trying to focus our energy so that we can ultimately get there. And I think the last thing I'd say about this that I think is also critical is that it has resulted in a lack of, I would say, faith in our institutions. So when people talk to me, for instance, about the vaccine and about underrepresented minorities, unwillingness to take it, it's because of issues like the distrust in law enforcement. It's most young people in that age group can't tell you about the Tuskegee experiment, but what they can tell you is that they've heard something about it and they associate that with the same distrust they have in law enforcement. And so all our governmental institutions all of a sudden are under attack. Our corporations, Wall Street, all of a sudden, even job creators that do a great job are demonized around this lack of trust in major institutions. And we, and I say we, including myself, because once you make that crossover from student to faculty to president, you become part of that group.
Right.
We have to continue to reach out and relate and say to them, listen, I have a 16-year-old son and a 40-year-old daughter. We're talking about mental health today. I have a father who committed suicide. And I have been open with my student buddy about that this is not just about your journey and your struggle, but a lot of these people are well-meaning and they actually have passed through some of the same struggles you have. And so they are not to necessarily be distrusted off the bat, but they are there to be engaged in a dialogue.
So true. So true. Again, really processing everything that you've said, and it's so meaningful. I thank you for sharing your personal experiences and your expertise with us as we looked at the young adult group. So we've looked at the children, talked about those young adults in many ways. And now I'm thinking about those young adults shifting into the workforce. I'm going to pivot back to our study. And Tamika, I'm coming to you next. I'll share a little bit about what we found with the workforce and hoping that you can share your own experiences and expertise when it comes to that. So our study found that 70% of full-time workers say that they feel the economic impact of COVID is actually worse than the virus itself. Wow. As the leader of such a large and dynamic organization, as Kathy described, right? You're responsible for so many aspects of your workforce, and I want to really tap into your expertise so others can learn from it. I'm thinking that a lot of your workforce pivoted to a work-at-home environment, and so they were already feeling potentially the stresses of work, and you were working and continued to work to encourage them and energize them. Now they're at home and they're piling on some additional stressors or some different kinds of stressors on a day-to-day basis. So how do you keep them focused and energized?
Yeah, no, and Monica, you are right. I mean, there are so many challenges as it relates to this. And I think personally for me, I have always led from a place of being authentic, empathetic, and to be inclusive. It's not something that happened as a result of COVID, right? And so I think when you lead from that standpoint, people feel very comfortable coming to you and explaining real stories. And we haven't had to look at it as a population of 14,000, but each individual person in terms of their own individual circumstances, and being in a multi-generational company as well is absolutely critical. And, a long time ago, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And so for me, it's always been so critical to make sure that people have felt like they are important, like their individual thoughts, what they're doing every day really matters. At Deloitte, we had instituted this well-being program now almost 3 years ago. We have a chief chief well-being officer. So we focus on the mental health of our people. You know, we aren't selling widgets, right? So we really do have to make sure that our people are able to bring their authentic selves to work each and every day, and that they feel like they're being respected and that we can be inclusive. And one of the ways I think we've done that in Washington, and Kathy mentioned this, is really a focus on kindness. So I was really clear about how important it was to be kind to one another. You know, I thought no one is ever going to argue with me about being kind. Sometimes when we have discussions around being inclusive, sometimes there are issues that are raised, et cetera. And I thought, you know what, if you just focus at the end of the day on being kind, we will inherently be inclusive and bring each other along. And so that's what we really started to focus on. And I know that Dr. Frederick mentioned his father, and in particular, it was important to me that we also appreciated that everybody has their own struggles, right? And that it was important that we took all of those things into account. And so, as many of you know, a couple of years ago, I was asked by Cynthia Germanata to serve on Lady Gaga's board, where we really focus on mental health and kindness to one another, and how critical it is that we are actually appreciating that everyone has their own battles, and that we don't know necessarily what people are dealing with or struggling with at home. And so it's important that we were actually focused on that. So when Dr. Chung talked about, you know, the resilience, I have always looked at resilience as a muscle, right? So when I think about my children, I'm like, are they developing that muscle where they are failing? They're not getting a trophy for coming in last place, right? It's important that those things are happening, and in a safe place, right? Where you can engage in that dialogue and you learn how to deal with that. You know, I think many years ago, my executive coach told me about, you know, told me the story about the Indian chief who said to his son about the two wolves. And he said, you have one good wolf and one bad wolf. Which wolf wins? And the boys looked at him and they didn't know the answer. And they said, the one that you feed. Right? So every day when I think about what am I doing to feed our people, to make sure that, you know, they feel like they're valued, that they're part of it, what am I feeding, right? Am I feeding where we're appreciating that, where we're giving these safe places to have dialogue, to have conversations? That's what we need to feed each and every day, because then that's the type of people that we're going to produce. You know, even I guess probably 3 years ago, I did a letter to my younger self where I shared sort of my deeper, darkest secrets, right? So because people really needed to be able to relate to their leader. And during COVID, in the very first, you know, couple of months, I actually wrote a letter about how I was feeling and how challenged I was and how scared I was and how I thought, you know, 30 years from now, I'll be looking back on this and I won't be afraid to touch my face. I won't, you know, have the fears of going to the grocery store. So we hope, right? And it was really important to tell our people that, because many of them were feeling the same way, and they had to know that that was real and that we were in some way validating it. Again, feeding the good wolf.
So much vulnerability, and as you said, the authenticity was there, right? And building upon it. Just thank you for sharing those. I can't write fast enough here and listen as well. I'm taking notes. So much to learn here. Tamika, I'm gonna stay with you, because I think that you create this opportunity for us to understand multi-generational workforce. And our study showed that employees that have access to programs at work, like employee resource groups, you mentioned just that open conversation with employees, the letter to your younger self, and really taking some of those tools and tricks, if you will, and really deploying them or talking about them openly are really helpful. Employees in our study said if their employer had those programs, that it was really helpful to them as they were managing their stress, and it was likely to help them have greater resiliency. And I know Deloitte has a plethora of programs that you work to talk about every single day. With your multi-generational workforce, are you facing challenges with that, or are you finding ways for these programs to be effective?
Yeah, and you know what, Monica, you're right. And we could be facing challenges with that, right? But the reality is we recognized a long time ago that we are in a multi-generational workforce. We have 70% of our professionals in Washington that are millennials. And then at the other side of that, we have our partners and even our managers who are coming near retirement at the age of 62. So there are a lot of things that are at play. And many of us don't know the experiences that individuals are having. You know, we are very fortunate. I have an office in my house. Most of our millennials do not, right? So they're sitting at the edge of their bed. They have other people, quite frankly, even our competitors that they live with, and they're trying to, engage in dialogue and be on Zoom 24/7. It is really challenging. And when we talk about coming back to work, we can't just think, okay, someone is 25 years old and they will be fine coming back to work, so we're going to suggest that, this population comes back, because the reality is we don't know if they're taking care of elderly parents or what their circumstances may be. So again, it was so important to, one, allow our people to engage in those discussions and to feel comfortable with it, and then come up with viable solutions for that. So we do this vital statistics where we can see, how our people are doing, the amount of hours that they've charged, the number of vacation days they've taken. Right now it is more critical than ever that people take time off. Sometimes people think it's ridiculous because you can't go anywhere, right? Or very limited in terms of your ability to travel. But the reality is that's the opportunity to just be still, to just take the time to be at home, to be present. I have learned so much that it is so much more important to be present than to be perfect. Kathy will tell you, I pride myself on this Kahlua cake that I make over the holidays. And this year I've decided I'm going to do a do-it-yourself cake in the spirit of this do-it-yourself moment. And so I thought on Sunday that I would have my children actually make the cake with me. And they each had their roles. My oldest son was going to be chopping the nuts. The younger son was going to spray the pan and pour the ingredients in. And it was a complete disaster. And I have a type A personality. And for the first couple of minutes, I was like, stop it. Come on, this is serious. Like, we're sending this to my clients. And I was, really on it. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to stop. I'm going to let them enjoy this moment. I'm going to let them feel like they're part of it, right? Because when you think about the battles, our life is constantly this suspension bridge, right? It is better to make sure that I am being present with them and I'm not so focused on being perfect. And that night when we were all done and the videographer had left, we played on the TV our bloopers from that night and loved it. They laughed, they felt like they were part of it. And I realized that that was so much more important than really producing this exceptional video on how to make a cake, because quite frankly, people could read the directions. So it is about sort of learning to do those things a lot differently.
Tamika, that is such a great story. I've had that Kahlua cake that you make, and that's worth it in the end for sure. But you've all shared such great memories, personal stories, with your expertise. I can't thank you enough for your openness to that and providing such insights today. Kathy, I see you're back, which
I am
might
back.
be my
There's
signal.
some questions. There are
Okay.
some questions for all of you that, and I like Tamika and one of our attendees just wrote, "Better to be present than perfect," and I think that is a really good quote. One of the questions, and I'm going to start with Dr. Frederick and Dr. Chung, is Dr. Frederick, you mentioned kids supporting one another, that's a great leadership lesson and a life lesson. How do we teach our kids to support one another? Because I believe they don't really know how. And how do you do that if they see their friends going through a hard time? How is that taught? And well, let me start. I think they're muted. So if we could unmute Dr. Chung and Dr. Frederick, that would be great, because I think Washingtonian has that. There we go, Dr. Frederick. How do we teach that?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. One is, I think you really want them to learn fairly organically, but you want to create a space where they're willing to come and tell you about the struggles that someone may be having, and to listen carefully and to get their suggestions. It may be baking a cake to make that friend feel better. My daughter loves making cupcakes, and those are what I call her kind of missives of love. And so when she starts baking cupcakes or cookies, I think there's somebody in distress that she is trying to cheer up. And sure enough, that's what she's trying to do. My son is a lot more stoic, and for him, it's, a pickup soccer game or suggesting some kind of physical activity. Or, he in the middle of the pandemic has been difficult. he suggested going for a walk in downtown Bethesda with a friend. And, I think having them really come to the table with their own ideas is just as helpful, so that they get to express themselves. But I think the primary thing that I think is important is creating a space where they are willing to even come and say there is somebody in distress and there is somebody who needs my help, because it empowers them to recognize the power of their own goodness as well.
So maybe part of it is on the parents. It does, the Cigna study shows 74% of parents are feeling stressed, but I think part of this is on parents to recognize or listen to their kids and help them support one another. Dr. Chung, do you have any advice on that from the mental perspective? Because I think peer-to-peer is so important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the recognition, again, depending on the age of your child, but if we're talking about the adolescent age, the peer to peer piece is where they get most of their advice, as much as we'd like it to be from the parent or parents, or their parents. So really making sure that your child just knows you're available. They may not want to actually talk to you directly, but I think making sure that that you check in. Is everything going okay? Just wanted to let you know I'm here if you need anything. And really, I do stress that, especially depending on your teenager. But if you do have a teenager that isn't interested in really that direct interaction nearly as much, if they're not nearly as chatty with you as they were when they were 7, I think just talking out loud and giving stories around them, if you're with them in the car, if you're having a meal with them, use that opportunity that you have with them to share stories about ways to be resilient without directly necessarily needing them to open up and tell you all about what's going on and with their friends, because they may not want to do that. If they are willing to do that, that's fantastic. But oftentimes the teenagers are more reticent than that.
Yeah, it's hard. I went to Cornell, and there was some issues there years back, and they had a campaign that said, if you learn one thing, learn to ask for help.
Mhm.
And I thought it was a very effective campaign, and it's something that we can teach. Tamika, you have thoughts?
Yeah, just one quick thought I just thought I'd add is, at Deloitte, we actually have a first aid for mental health. And we, as you all know, when you have CPR training, everybody remembers that and they know what the purpose is, but actually teaching people to recognize when there are challenges around mental health is phenomenal. At Born This Way Foundation, we focus on teen first aid for mental health, so teenagers can recognize when people need help, et cetera. So I would highly encourage you all to even, Dr. Frederick, when I think about the students at Howard, doing a first aid for mental health there would be phenomenal, so that they're recognizing it at Cigna. So we offer it now online for our firm, so people take the course and they can recognize when there are challenges, because part of it's recognition, right? Sometimes people don't even know what they're going through.
Right, and it's recognition for them. The learn part was learn to ask for help, but it's also learn to get help for somebody, because people will tell you they're fine when they're not. Monica, do you have something like that at Cigna?
I will second Tamika. What a great addition. So mental health first aid is something that we've rolled out within our organization, and also feels it's so important that we've certified members of our staff to go out into the community to share it as well. So really good call out. Appreciate that.
And here's a question from one of the attendees. Do you all look at this and see this as a trauma in the traditional sense? I mean, I know I look at it sort of like people who went through World War II at home. They buckled down, and I think of a trauma as a more tight episode. But is this a trauma for our kids? Is this a trauma for our teachers?
Everybody.
I'm not sure there's a medical definition, but are we going to see PTSD? Are we going to, Dr. Chung, do you think this is trauma?
Yeah, I was about to say that. I do think that we will see some PTSD post the pandemic. And it may be from various reasons and various sources, the direct, obvious, the impact of the virus it's had on your daily life, but certainly those who have suffered economically. Those we also know, as in fact for children, the reports to CPS for child protective cases where suspected child abuse is reported, those reports have gone way down. And part of the reason we think is that the ability of other adults outside the family to see what's happening to a child, because typically those who report CPS, 40% of reports come from the school setting. Others may come from healthcare providers or other settings. So there are fewer outside adults who are laying eyes on children right now, and unfortunately, that's going to have a downstream impact on those kids. So,
Dr. Frederick, do you think this is a trauma?
Yeah, I think it is. But I also think that it's going to create a golden generation. I think there have been generations in the past in American society that have been affected by wars, et cetera. And out of that, came, I think, a societal kind of coming together to really propel that group forward. And I actually think that our young people who are going through this right now will form a golden generation. I think that they will turn this into grit and resilience, as we've been speaking about. But I also think that their compassion for one another and the interconnectedness of our humanity is something that will always resonate with them. I think the way we looked at frontline workers, which was obviously proven to be wrong, I think they're growing up in a society where those people are going to be cherished and they're going to recognize the importance of those people. And, as Tamika says, Tamika calls it kindness. I like to use the word love around here, that as we learn to lead with love, it's the ultimate solution. And I think this generation will lead with love.
Wow. There's a ton of questions, but I'm going to do one or two more, but that would have been the perfect ending because it's such a positive one. And some of the questions are a little harder than that, such as, there's one about kids, elementary school kids watching the news. Some find it really stressful, and then some have a lot of questions. And, the study shows that kids are stressed about this. So what is your advice, Dr. Chung, on watching the news for young kids?
Yeah, I think what we do with the news is not different in a pandemic than what we would have done before with the news. So same for stories and things. What's interesting is that with people working from home, children are overhearing our adult conversations more than before. The other day, my daughter was like, "Oh, you're doing something in mental health, and there's a staffing issue that's happening, and this is happening." And I'm like, "How do you know?" She's like, "Oh, I heard you." So they're hearing all of your conversations. So I think be aware of what you're saying. Not that you should mute yourself, but inside your own home, but figuring out where your kids are when you're having these conversations, because obviously as adults we're having to deal with anxiety as well. But if your child sees the news, as I said before, I think it's important to have a conversation about it. The way that they're processing the news is probably different than the way you're processing the news. So first have them reflect on what they think they're hearing, and then you can go forward from there.
So a lot of it is open dialogue. I mean, social media was an issue before this, because I know one of the things that Monica and Tamika have talked about is, social media people sort of show their best self. And so and there are a lot of studies out there that show that, Facebook brag or whatever it is, Snapchat, it can make you feel worse because it seems that, people don't post their vulnerable, hard moments. Monica, did Cigna look at social media at all? Is there any advice you have on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely part of the study, and you can click on it. Anyone can go to the study and look at it. But I think that is a good opportunity to amplify the conversation around this. Tamika, just in brief conversation with you earlier, you referenced that back to what Kathy said, that shows our youth, it shows our young adults, everyone else's best self. And so if you couple that with what Dr. Frederick said, which is leading with love, or Tamika's leading with kindness, let's take away that lens, right? The study talks about how to build that resilience in the youth, in saying, this is your real self. Let's bring that forward. And I know that we all work with organizations in the community that can help with that. So this is the time for me of making that connection, right? Through our businesses, through the community, through the healthcare community, at a time where all eyes are on us, right? All eyes are on the health and the resilience of this population, whether it be the workforce, the youth, or the children. And let's bring all those entities together to make sure that we're shining a light on this and making that pivot point.
Yeah, and the teachers, of course.
You got it.
I want, we're gonna finish now. I don't want to go over time. I think the thing that I walked away from listening to all of you, the thing that resonates with me is, Dr. Frederick, you said, find the joy. And if we can find joy ourselves, we can share that with other people, and that might be different from family to family. So for kids and mental health, it's listening, and then it's finding ways to help them find their joy. And if we find our own joy, we can push that forward, because there is a lot going on out there, and we could talk for hours. Monica, thank you. And we will put a link out for the study so people can read it, because there is a lot in there. Thank you, and thanks Cigna for doing it. Tamika, thank you for sharing your perspective, overseeing so many people, and to both the doctors on the panel, deepest gratitude for your work on the front lines and for looking out for these vulnerable communities that you both oversee. Thank you, all of you.